Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session where we'll be talking about cognitive changes which occur with aging. I'm the chair of this session. I'm Associate Professor Joanne Ryan, and I'm from the School of Public Health and Preventative Medicine at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. So as a lot of you will be aware, globally we have an aging population, and people aged over 65 years are the fastest growing age group in most countries around the world. And this age population is expected to almost double by 2057. With aging, there are changes in cognitive function, which can be gradual, but are ongoing and also highly variable between individuals. They're also variable depending on the cognitive domains. So cognitive aging is not at all synonymous with cognitive decline. However, as individuals get older, most will experience some loss of cognitive ability. Now, cognitive decline is really one of the most feared sequelae of aging. Individuals become increasingly concerned about any loss or decline in cognitive function for fear that this may lead to a loss of independence and also could be an early sign as a risk factor for dementia. So the aim of this session is really to talk about the natural evolution of cognitive function with aging and really the desire to have a better understanding of cognitive changes which occur with age, in particular factors that can influence cognitive aging and outcomes from cognitive changes with age. So this knowledge could really lead to new strategies to promote optimal cognitive aging in older age. So today we have three speakers, all PhD students, who are going to talk about their topics. And the first student is Joe Wrigglesworth, who's a final year PhD student. And Joe's been investigating a new neuroimaging biomarker, which is called brain age, and which is thought to be able to provide an estimate of someone's biological aging or how the brain is aging, and really look at individuals who have a brain age which is different from their chronological age. Our second speaker is Zimu, who's also a final year PhD student. And Zimmer will be talking about cognitive trajectories in later life, and we'll be identifying factors which are predictive of those cognitive trajectories and also outcomes that are associated with different cognitive trajectories in older individuals. The final speaker is another PhD student, Svana, and Svana will be looking at how cardiovascular events can influence cognitive trajectories. So comparing cognitive function both prior and after a cardiovascular event. I'm sure you'll find this session really exciting and I look forward to a lot of interesting questions from you at the end. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Zimu from Monash University. And today I'm going to present the two studies that investigated modifiable factors and the outcomes associated with cognitive aging trajectories. And for these two studies, we used the study sample from the ASPRI clinical trial, which is a large cohort of older individuals from Australia and the United States, with more than 19,000 participants recruited at a baseline. The inclusion criteria for age was 70 years or above for non-minorities and 65 years or above for African American or Hispanic or Latino. At baseline, the participants were required to be free of any major diseases or any life-threatening illness. So this is a generally and relatively healthy study sample. In this cohort, cognitive assessment was done at baseline and during follow-up for up to 7 years. And there are 4 tests used in this study, including 3MS for general cognitive function, COET for verbal fluency, HVLTR delayed recall task for episodic memory, as well as SDMT for psychomotor speed. For the statistical method, we used group-based trajectory modeling to generate the trajectories of cognitive function over the 7 years, and also used these trajectories to define cognitive performance. And this is a method that can partition the study sample into multiple latent subgroups based on the longitudinal patterns of a variable. and individuals in the same subgroup all follow similar trajectories of a variable, and different subgroups got distinct trajectories of this variable. So the figure at the right is a typical output of group-based trajectory modeling. And in addition, we also use structural equation modeling to analyze the determinants or the predictors associated with these distinct trajectory subgroups. And we also used binary logistic regression models to analyze the incident outcomes associated with these cognitive trajectories prospectively. We firstly looked at the number of modifiable determinants of cognitive performance. And in this study, we firstly discovered the joint trajectory profile in the S3 population, and also looked at the associations of a number of modifiable factors measured at baseline with high and low cognitive performance over follow-up, separately defined by high and low cognitive trajectories. And the modifiable factors we investigated include education, 3 health behaviors, including smoking, alcohol intake, and living alone. And we also looked at a number of chronic conditions that are quite common in late life among older individuals. Here is the joint trajectory profile we found this time. And we used an extension of group-based trajectory modeling. It's called group-based multi-trajectory modeling. And this method can identify the latent subgroups and also generate the trajectories of multiple indicators. And since we got 4 cognitive tests used in this study, so we used this extension of group-based trajectory modeling. And the model identified 7 trajectory classes this time. We firstly labeled class 1 as the high performers because this class got the highest baseline and also the minimum decline across the 4 tests. So they're definitely the best cognitive performers. And we labeled class 7 as the low performers because, in contrast, this class got the lowest baseline and the most substantial decline, and again across the 4 tests. So they're probably the worst cognitive performers. And we use class 4 as the reference group, the average performer group, and we use this medium class as the reference group for all the association analysis. Here are the direct associations we found. We firstly found 3 factors that are associated with both of the 2 subgroups, but in the reverse directions. Education and alcohol seem to be protective factors because they are associated with higher probability of having high cognitive performance and lower risk of low cognitive performance, or in other words, cognitive decline. And frailty seems to be a risk factor because it got an opposite direction in its association with cognitive performance compared to education and alcohol intake. We also found a number of risk factors that are associated with only one of the 2 subgroups. These include living alone at home, hypertension, obesity, dyslipidemia, diabetes, depression, and chronic kidney disease. Since they are all risk factors, so you're associated with either lower probability of having high cognitive performance or higher risk of cognitive decline. And smoking was not directly associated with either of the 2 subgroups. What was presented in the last slide were the direct associations between these modifiable factors and cognitive performance. So if we visualize those direct associations, they should be the solid arrows in this diagram. But we are also interested in how behavior factors can be indirectly associated with cognitive function by affecting the risk of these chronic conditions. And we also investigated how education could be associated with differential behavioral factors. We conducted a path model using these variables. And from this path model, we can see smoking was associated with higher risk of several chronic conditions, including obesity, diabetes, and frailty, even though it was not directly associated with cognitive function in the last slide. And alcohol intake, in contrast, was associated with lower risk of many chronic conditions, including hypertension, dyslipidemia, obesity, frailty, and chronic kidney disease. So alcohol intake appeared to be a protective factor. And living alone increased the risk of several chronic conditions, including diabetes, frailty, and depression, but it was also associated with lower risk of dyslipidemia cross-sectionally. And higher education was associated with higher probability of being an alcohol drinker, and those living alone at home at baseline were also more likely to be smokers. So in conclusion, there is a large overlap between promotion of high cognitive performance and prevention of cognitive decline, and this includes higher education, smoking cessation, low to moderate alcohol intake, supporting those living alone at home, and prevention of frailty. Smoking cessation and supporting those living alone at home are not actually directly associated with cognitive function, the two cognitive subgroups directly in the last slide, but they were both associated with several chronic conditions, so we still put them in the middle. And specifically for promotion of high cognitive performance, we should probably pay attention to blood pressure, healthy body weight, prevention of diabetes, and improving mental health. And specifically for preventative strategies, then maintaining blood lipids at a normal level might be helpful. And after that, we looked at a number of outcomes that were associated prospectively with these cognitive trajectories. And the outcomes investigated include dementia, persistent physical disability, and all-cause mortality. And to ensure the temporality or the temporal issues of this association analysis, we only analyze those event cases that occurred after the time frame of these cognitive trajectories. So in other words, the 7 years between 2010 and 2017, which is the trial phase of this ASPRI cohort. And we excluded all those event cases that occurred during this trial phase. So this is the time frame of this association analysis. And here are the results of the associations with dementia risk. They are presented as odds ratios. But firstly, these are the trajectories we identified this time. We modeled the trajectories of each individual cognitive test because we were interested in how specific cognitive domains were associated with specific health outcomes. And we can see between 3 and 5 cognitive trajectories were identified depending on the cognitive test. And all the trajectories of all these cognitive tests were strongly associated with subsequent risk of dementia. But the difference of dementia risk was less marked across the trajectory classes of co-ed. So verbal fluency seems to be less sensitive to dementia risk compared to other cognitive domains. And in terms of physical disability, we only found a significant association in the lowest trajectory class of SDMT, psychomotor speed. And for all-cause mortality, lower trajectories of 3MS and HVLTR delayed recall task showed increased risk of all-cause mortality. So in conclusion, decline across all cognitive tests were associated with higher risk of dementia, even though this is less remarkable in the trajectories of co-ed. And only slow psychomotor speed was associated with higher risk of physical disability, and also low performance in global cognitive function assessed by 3MS and episodic memory assessed by HVLTR delayed recall task were associated with higher risk of all-cause mortality. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jo, and I will be presenting my findings related to a neuroimaging biomarker of brain age. Aging is a biological phenomenon characterized by a gradual accumulation of cellular and molecular damage and subsequent loss of physiological functions. The brain is particularly susceptible to these effects of aging, undergoing many structural and functional changes over the lifespan. And this includes brain atrophy, which has been associated with cognitive decline and a greater risk of neurodegenerative disorders. Cognitive decline and disorders like dementia are one of the most common causes of disability in later life. However, despite these commonalities, aging is a considerably diverse process. So while some of us will be able to maintain high cognitive proficiency well into later life, others will experience severe declines. And it's for this reason that chronological age is limited as a marker of age-related outcomes. Brain age is this innovative biomarker that uses statistical modeling and neuroimaging to provide a measure of an individual's biological age. Brain age is constructed for its correlation with chronological age, and this is represented by the dotted line in this figure. So if you have a positive or negative deviation of brain age from this line, that's considered a sign of accelerated or decelerated biological aging. The extent to which a person's brain age deviates from their chronological age could be used as a predictor of cognitive decline, but also help us identify factors that are good or bad for our brain health. But how does it all work? How do we get this estimate of brain age? Well, firstly, a researcher will get a statistical model to learn which brain features best predict chronological age for an independent cohort. They then determine the accuracy of this prediction by validating it on another independent cohort. So really the utility of any model depends on its ability to generalize to this new independent cohort. So based on this concept of brain age, I will be presenting evidence that addressed two key aims. The first was investigating the association between baseline brain aging and cognitive performance, while the second looks at determining which participant characteristics are associated with cross-sectional and longitudinal changes in brain aging. Data was acquired from participants of the ESPRI neuroimaging sub-study. ESPRI is a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled primary prevention trial that was aimed to determine whether a low dose of aspirin could extend disability-free life in older individuals aged 70 years and above. Neuro involves 572 consenting ESPRI participants who were recruited from participating GPs, which were distributed around the Melbourne district in Australia. These participants would attend scanning at baseline, but also had the opportunity to attend follow-up scans about 1 and 3 years after baseline. During these visits, we would obtain measures of brain morphometry, microstructure and function, which were acquired on a 3T scanner. At randomization, ESPRI had measured these participants as being cognitively normal and free of any history of dementia. For this study, we derived our estimates of brain age from T1 weighted images using a publicly available software provided by Colin colleagues. So as I was explaining before, this essentially means that the model had already learned which brain features best predict chronological age for an independent cohort. We then have utilized that information to get our estimates of brain age for our study participants. Now, the actual steps involved in this model are very briefly described here, which I'll run through with you. So to initiate that model, it will first pre-process your images. And this is where your T1 weighted images are segmented into gray matter, white matter, and cerebral spinal fluid volume, and then normalized using a nonlinear registration. These volume features are then combined and reduced down to 435 principal components. And it's from these that we get that estimate of brain age via a Gaussian process regression algorithm. So through our investigations so far, we've actually found this model to predict brain age with a moderate accuracy for our study participants. And this is shown here in this scatter plot, by which you can see a relatively moderate relationship between brain age, which is here on the y-axis, and chronological age on the x-axis. We've also found brain age to have excellent retest reliability, and this was indicated by an intraclass correlation coefficient that was greater than 0.9. But also by the fact that the change in brain age was approximately 1 and 3 years, which coincides with the follow-up period of 1 and 3 years. The brain predicted age difference was used to define that deviation of brain age from chronological age. So if you have a positive brain pad value, that indicates to us that you have an older brain age relative to your chronological age, while a negative brain pad value suggests a younger brain age relative to your chronological age. As a part of the ESPRIT study, the participants would complete a battery of neuropsychological tests that assessed a range of cognitive domains, and this includes verbal fluency, delayed recall, psychomotor speed, and global cognitive function. We use that cognitive data to be able to investigate the association between baseline brain aging and baseline cognitive function, as well as the 3-year change in cognitive function. We defined this change in cognitive function as being the difference between baseline and the 3-year cognitive assessment. Of the 572 neuro participants, 531 had usable MRI and cognitive data at baseline. As you can see highlighted here, the majority of these individuals were aged 70 to 74 years, had completed 12 or more years of education, resided in more advantaged areas, were overweight and hypertensive. 259 of these individuals had completed a 3rd-year cognitive assessment, so they comprised of our longitudinal subsample. The remaining 272 couldn't be included in that sample because they hadn't completed the 3rd-year cognitive assessment, but they were statistically similar with the exception of gender, by which they had more women and fewer men. So at baseline, we observed a statistically significant but weak association between accelerated brain aging and poor psychomotor speed and delayed recall. Now, I'll just remind you, when I say accelerated brain aging, I'm referring to having an older brain age relative to your chronological age. While these findings still remained when we adjusted for various different types of covariates, it didn't only the association with psychomotor speed had survived our correction for multiple testing. We also observed a statistically significant but weak association between accelerated brain aging and the 3-year delayed recall. However, this didn't survive our correction for multiple testing. Now, also as a part of the ESPRIT study, participants would complete various different types of questionnaires and physical assessments. And this allowed us to obtain information regarding their sociodemographics, their psychological well-being and physical function. And we utilized that data to be able to assess which baseline participant characteristics were associated with a baseline and a change in brain pads. Now, as you can see here, by this margin plot, we observed a statistically significant sex difference. And this is where males actually had a faster rate of brain aging over the 3-year follow-up. Now, while this was a relatively weak effect, we were able to confirm it with an additional analysis, which I'll just run through with you now. So for this additional analysis, we performed a multinomial logistic regression model whereby we determined which baseline participant characteristics predicted the likelihood of brain pad accelerating, decelerating, relative to remaining stable over the 3-year follow-up. Now, to be able to actually analyze that, we firstly had to group people according to their brain pad value increasing or decreasing by 2 or more years over the 3-year follow-up. And this is shown here by these graphs, by which you can see people who were defined as accelerate had an increase of 2 or more years, while those who decelerated had a decrease. And this was relative to those people that remained stable, which, as you can see here, there's not much happening over the 3-year follow-up. So now going back to our sex differences, through this additional analysis, we were able to show that women had a reduced odds of brain pad accelerating compared to males over that 3-year follow-up period. Now, on our other findings, we also observed that having a greater physical quality of life and better verbal fluency associated with a faster rate of brain aging over the 3-year follow-up, which is quite unusual, but you can see it right here in these margin plots. And also unusual was the fact that people with depressive symptoms had a slower rate of brain aging over the 3-year follow-up. Now, how this differs to, say, our sex differences was that this was not a consistent finding with our additional analysis. So overall, through our investigations, we were able to find evidence that brain age could be used as a measure of cognitive aging, in particular processing speed, and that males have a faster rate of brain aging than females. However, currently in the brain age literature, there's really relatively little information regarding these findings. So really we need further prospective studies to confirm what I've presented to you here today. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank the IAGG for hosting this event, for all my colleagues and supervisors and the participants of the ESPRI and Neuro study. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present today. I'm going to be talking about cognitive change and the risk of dementia in older adults who have had an incident cardiovascular disease. The work I'm presenting today is part of my PhD titled The Heart-Brain Connection. The number of people aged over 60 years has more than doubled since 1980 and is expected to double again by 2050. The population is aging at a faster pace now than in the past. This is important because it brings with it changes in population needs and demand for healthcare. The health system will need to cater to people in their 80s and 90s. While some older adults live relatively free from chronic illness, others can live for years with chronic illnesses that once proved fatal. Cardiovascular diseases that include a group of disorders of the heart and blood vessels is one such area where improvements in treatment have led to decreased mortality rates. Due to its increased prevalence in the aging population, cognitive decline and dementia are also common in individuals who have survived a cardiovascular event. Previous studies have found that there is an association between cardiovascular diseases and cognition. However, there are several limitations to these studies. The main limitation was the lack of prospective studies exploring this relationship between cardiovascular disease and cognitive decline and dementia. The majority of these studies collected information on the cardiovascular event retrospectively and hence could not include cognitive assessments prior to an event. Additionally, in the majority of the studies, they had no information on the time of CVD event, which makes it difficult to understand the temporal relationship between these variables. So while existing studies are able to establish that there is an association between cardiovascular disease and cognitive change and dementia, they are unable to delineate this relationship further. So there was a need for a large clinical cohort study to explore the relationship between cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and dementia. Hence, the specific aim here was to determine how a cardiovascular disease event influences cognitive function over time and the incidence of dementia. Data from the ASPRI clinical trial, which was a randomized controlled trial investigating the effect of low-dose aspirin, has provided us with an opportunity to address this aim. The ASPRI study included 19,114 participants from Australia and the United States, aged over 70 years, and they prospectively collected a wide range of data over the course of the follow-up period. All ASPRI participants were free from cardiovascular disease or major cognitive impairment at baseline. The exposure variable for this study is an incident cardiovascular event, which was a composite of coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, stroke, and hospitalization for heart failure. We had two outcome variables, dementia and cognition. Dementia was adjudicated according to the DSM-4 criteria, and cognition included 4 cognitive domains: the overall global cognition, which was measured using 3MS, delayed recall, measured by the revised Hopkins verbal learning test, processing speed, measured by the symbol digit modalities test, and verbal fluency, using controlled oral word association test. These cognitive assessments were administered by trained and accredited staff at baseline and year 1, and then every 2 years over a maximum of 7 years. Here's a visual representation of the data collection, and I just wanted to highlight a few possible scenarios for data collection here. Let us assume that these are our study participants, and at baseline, they are all free from cardiovascular disease or any major cognitive impairment. Now, participants could have gone through the whole study period without having any CVD events or dementia. However, participants who had an incident CVD event that could have occurred at any time during follow-up. Similarly, there could be variation amongst those who had both dementia and CVD, either one of which could have occurred first. So when exploring the relationship between these variables, it was important to consider a robust methodology that could incorporate all these variations. For analyzing the impact of CVD event on dementia, we used incidence rates and compared them between the CVD and no CVD groups. And for cognitive change, we used linear mixed models. The key descriptive statistics are presented here. There were a total of 922 CVD events, which is about 5.8% of ASPRI participants. The median age for ASPRI participants was 74 years, and 43.6% of this cohort was male. Presented here are also details on baseline health status and baseline cognitive scores of all ASPRI participants. Moving on to the main results, there were a total of 575 participants, or 3% of ASPRI participants, adjudicated as having dementia. A total of 53 cases, which was around 5.7% of all participants with a CVD event, also had dementia, compared to only 2.9% in the no CVD group. The absolute difference between these two groups was 2.8%, which was significant. However, approximately half of those with dementia in the CVD group were adjudicated with dementia prior to their CVD event. Given these small numbers, we were unable to perform any other formal statistical analysis for dementia risk after a CVD event. This slide includes the results from the linear mixed models for the repeated measures cognition variable. I just wanted to take a moment and explain the two regression models presented here. Model A explores the acute changes in cognition after a CVD event, and Model B looks at both acute changes and also change in cognition over time after an event. So looking at these results in the final model, we see that there is an overall decline in global cognition over the study follow-up period. So to clarify, this includes scores of all participants included in the ESPRI study and is shown by the purple line there. Now, for those who had a CVD event, we see an acute drop in global cognition after a CVD event, which was significant and is shown there on the graph. And finally, after a CVD event, the decline in global cognition over time is much steeper, and we see that on the graph too. Here are the results from Model A and B for the other cognitive domains. We see a slight but significant improvement in delayed recall scores at an overall level for all participants. But for those who had a CVD event, there is a decline in delayed recall scores after an event. For processing speed, there is an overall decline in scores over the follow-up period. And after a CVD event, we see a significant acute drop in processing speed scores. Finally, for verbal fluency, we see an improvement in scores at an overall level, but we notice a significant decline in verbal fluency in the years following a cardiovascular disease. To summarize our results, we've seen that the incidence rates of dementia in people with a CVD event is higher than those without a CVD event. There are consistent associations with not only global cognition, but also some other cognitive domains. However, a CVD event impacts these domains differently. There is an acute drop in global cognition and processing speed after a cardiovascular disease event. And there is also a decline in global cognition, delayed recall, and verbal fluency in the years following a CVD event. These findings have several clinical implications. The main one is the need for both short-term and long-term monitoring of cognition after a CVD event. Additionally, these results suggest that it is important to include cognitive training as part of the recovery for those who have had cardiovascular disease. There were a few limitations to this study. Given the short follow-up period in a population with relatively healthy individuals, there were only a few dementia cases following a CVD event, which restricted our analysis. Another factor to consider would be the generalizability of these findings to a larger population, given that the study participants reached age 70 without any major CVD or cognitive impairment. However, with more people reaching older age in a generally good health, we believe that these findings will become increasingly relevant to a larger proportion of the population. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining that session. 3 really wonderful presentations. So I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. We have some questions for our different speakers. So I might start with you, Swana, just based on the presentation you've just presented now. I was just wondering that there were some differences depending on the cognitive domains that were examined, and whether that was a surprising finding or it was something that you were anticipating, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Joanne, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So
So with normal aging, there are changes that occur to cognition anyway, and they usually are to do with cognitive tasks that require speed. So for example, like processing speed, working memory, and executive functioning. But what surprised us was that the different cognitive domains were impacted differently after an event. So processing speed dropped almost immediately after the event, whereas the other domains, there was a gradual decline over the years. So that definitely surprised us, and it might warrant further research, which can then help develop some cognitive interventions.
Okay, great. So we do have a question that's coming from the audience, and it's related to another question that I had from somebody earlier. And so the question here is really wonderful projects and presentations. How do the speakers think that the health system should respond to their findings? So I guess what is some of the take-home message? So the other question that I had previously was the take-home message for older adults, but also in terms of clinicians and the health system in general. What are some of the, I guess, the implications of these findings from your work? Joe, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that, Joanne, and thank you for everyone for watching. But that's a really good question. Regarding just talking on behalf of Brain Age, I guess the whole point of Brain Age is starting to look at more individualized approaches to people. So rather than just kind of categorizing and grouping people based on their diagnostics, start taking a bit more of an individualized approach. So I guess that would be the take-home message, that we are starting to see through some of these biomarkers that there is different aging trajectories and that people do vary, and that this is something that's definitely worth exploring a bit more.
Yeah. Great. Zimu, did you have anything else to add on that point in regards to the take-home messages for clinicians, for health services, or even for older individuals themselves?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Joanne. I think to maintain good cognitive function for older individuals, it's also very important to maintain healthy lifestyles and adequate social networks. And it's also very crucial to pay attention to cardiovascular diseases, metabolic diseases, and mental health problems. But on the other hand, it's also very important to pay attention to cognitive function itself, because it can be an early marker of many health outcomes. So this is another aspect. And also, our study showed that the predictors of high cognitive function are probably a bit different from those risk factors of cognitive decline. So promotional strategies may be different from preventative strategies targeting on dementia prevention. Yeah.
So it almost emphasizes that we should really be looking at these as two separate things. A lot of attention has been paid, obviously, to cognitive decline and dementia, but really, if we can maintain optimal cognitive health for all older individuals, I think that will be of benefit for everyone.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, great. Sorry, just to say that question was marked by Katrina Davis. And so now I have another question from Cooper Ingenborg. So this is for you, Swana. So thank you for an interesting presentation. As a clinician, I recognise this association between cardiovascular disease and cognition. Can you elaborate on what might be some of the possible mechanisms or causes for that relationship?
Thank you for that question. At this stage, unfortunately, I'm not yet sure of the possible mechanisms, but I think one of the things to consider is that they share common risk factors. So for example, the cardiovascular risk factors that are especially modifiable, which are physical inactivity, obesity, those are the risk factors that we can target. Maybe that the shared risk factors are something that might inform the possible mechanisms, but unfortunately at this stage, I'm not sure of that yet.
Yeah, great. And just a related question. So do you know if there's a common genetic risk factors? Has there been any research that has looked at that at all? Again, unfortunately, I'm not sure of that as yet, but definitely health factors such as high blood pressure and cholesterol are also risk factors for both cardiovascular disease and dementia. So I'm sure they should be associated
associated genetic factors, risk factors as well. Yeah.
It is interesting because I think, at least in Australia, we tend to have the Heart Association, which is putting out messages around cardiovascular disease prevention, and we have the Alzheimer's and Dementia Association that are putting out messages around prevention of dementia, whereas they do share a lot of common factors. And so it really begs the question whether there should just be one message. And exercising more and having a healthy diet and maintaining good controlled blood pressure would be beneficial for a lot of things. So probably also prevent other chronic conditions as well. So something we should be looking out for. Okay, I have another question here from Zoe Lim. I think this one is for you, maybe, Joe. So what could be some possible explanations between the associations between more active lifestyle and depression with slower brain aging? So I think this is one of the unusual findings that's come out of your research, and whether you have thought about any possible explanations for that, or it's still something you're going to explore a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to confirm, was it specific to physical activity and brain aging, and then or do you mean, sorry, the mental well-being and the finding on the depression and brain aging, explaining that unusual finding? Yeah.
I think it was those unusual ones that went in the reverse direction.
No, that was a great question, and good for pointing that out. That was really something unexpected. The possibilities regarding that, look, I'm not quite sure. I haven't quite seen that sort of thing before in the literature. Usually you would probably expect something more like someone with depression, maybe a form of accelerated brain aging. So it was a bit of a surprise. I think in that case then, really further studies are really required to kind of better understand what that could possibly be, because they're just, I've not quite seen that sort of thing before.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's, do you think it's possibility that individuals with depression already had advanced brain aging, so when you look at it over time, you don't actually capture that decline? Is that possible, and something that maybe you could tease out with further research?
I think definitely with further research, longer time frames as well. So, a lot of things do tend to get picked up, say, even from midlife, and then later on you don't tend to see such clear changes. So I think longer studies and more studies as well, to kind of distinguish if this is something that's happening for the long term or if it is just specific to older people as well. And I think that sort of thing will kind of better understand the meaning behind some of these findings.
Yeah, because I don't know if you have that data in ASPREE, but to actually look at things like whether it's a first onset late life depression, or whether it's individuals that have maybe had depression, as you say, from their midlife or across their lifetime.
Exactly.
Which is perhaps already exerted its effect if it has an effect earlier. But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting.
Very interesting, yeah.
So another question for you, Zimu. So everybody's interested to know whether we can maintain really good cognitive function even as we get really old into our 90s, because I think people are quite concerned, even if, I mean, risk of dementia is obviously is a prominent concern, in particular for people who have family history, but also just even short-term memory changes or other cognitive changes as individuals get older. It is a concern for a number of people. So do you think it's possible that we can maintain really good cognitive function until we reach 100?
Oh, that's a really good question, but it's also a very tricky one. So firstly, I think at the population level, it's not really common to see such a phenomenon, because at least based on the results of our findings of our study, we can see if we look at those declining trajectories, those who age 75 years or above always account for the majority. And if we look at the previous studies, age has always been a very one of the most significant risk factors of cognitive decline. But at individual level, I think that's definitely possible because there are participants who are in their late 80s or even 90s, showing high and stable cognitive trajectories. And I'm pretty sure in our real life, we can also see such kind of people with advanced age, but also with their mind remaining sharp. Yeah, so I think that's really possible. That's also possible if they have those protective factors and avoid risk factors, and also their genetic architecture might also play a role. But this is still something under investigation. But I think it's possible. But as I said, not common.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And so the ESPRIT study obviously has a wealth of data, and you've been able to look at a lot of different aspects. Is there a limitation in that was a clinical trial and that the participants who've been recruited to participate in that study were obviously needed to be free of a certain number of health conditions? Obviously, they need to be willing to be involved in the clinical trial anyway. Do you think that will limit the generalizability of the findings from your research? Swana, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joanne. I definitely agree. If we look at the current generalizability, it probably is slightly limited, but we're also seeing a lot of people going well into their 80s and 90s. And actually, with your question to Zemo, I have a personal story. So my grandmother is 100 and her cognition is still completely intact.
Wow.
So I think, we are seeing that trend. So I definitely believe that these results will help us and will be more generalizable with the coming population.
Okay. Joe, did you have any further thought about that? Do you think the participants in do you think what you're seeing in terms of brain aging is representative of the broader population, or do you think it's quite specific to these?
Yeah, I mean, the ESPRIT study are quite an unusually healthy group of people, but that's not necessarily a limitation in itself. It's just, I mean, in research anyway, we always need to have new and different cohorts anyway. So it definitely adds a lot of value, but it does limit the findings to an extent because they are just healthy. But I agree with everything, like with what Swana was saying. I still think it's very informative, particularly to look then at things of just like, okay, so you've got really healthy people. Well, how did their cognition go? And what is it about them anyway that makes them so healthy? So there are a lot of different approaches that we could take with a really healthy group of people like the ESPRIT study. So possibly a limitation in the sense of just generalizability to the general population, because obviously there's a lot of variability in all of us. But it's still very informative in a different way of like, well, who are these really healthy people and what is it that they do that to stay so cognitively with high cognitive function and so forth. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll just finish with one final question. So this is for you, Zimu. So there seems to be increasing focus on looking not just at cognitive function, but really the interaction between, not necessarily the interaction, but how cognitive function and physical function work together. And even social functioning. So there's these notions of, of being both socially, physically, and cognitively well, and maximizing and optimizing in those different domains. Your analysis is quite complex and uses, complex methodology. Is there the possibility of looking not just at cognitive trajectories, but how cognitive trajectories could also marry with physical trajectories? Have you thought about doing something like that?
Yeah, definitely. The current study only modeled the trajectories of cognitive function, but as we all know, physical function and cognitive function are strongly associated with mutual effects on each other. and also social networks is also one of the interaction terms. So it's definitely promising to model the joint trajectories of these several measures to see how they change simultaneously, how synchronized they are, how different they are. And because there is still a lack of evidence in terms of the causal relationships between these measures. So it's definitely a very good future direction to look at the joint trajectories of multiple related measures.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we've had quite a few questions from the audience, and I think we might wrap up the session there. But thank you again to all our speakers, Zimu, Joe, Swana. It's been a really interesting presentation, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Thank you.